guys, this is Kenjiro and welcome to another PaintShop Pro video. Today I'm going to be demonstrating a way that you can colorize an illustration. Now, not too long ago, I was sent a message just asking about learning some ways to be able to colorize an illustration, perhaps for a book, something more on the cartoony side, not necessarily trying to be realistic. So for this demo, as I've done some experimenting with this, I was fortunately given the opportunity to use this image that you see here as an example to demonstrate the technique that I'm going to apply. In the end, we start with this sort of a drawing, this hand sketched on some pretty textured paper, and then end up with something that looks like this. Now, this is a full-fledged, render of the entire image. I'm not going to cover all of the steps that are involved in going from the original image to this one, but I do want to cover a few things about color schemes, how to get good lines so that you can actually do this technique of isolating certain regions and texturing and adding some shadows. But also just the whole process of taking one single region, and we'll focus on the pathway in this video, and how to give the pathway this sort of texture, this color, and some of the shadowing that you see on there. And that technique can be applied to every different region of the image to ultimately end up with an image like this. So before we jump into any specific techniques on how to actually build one of these regions, I do want to take a quick moment to touch on one capability that I really appreciate in PaintShop Pro. I don't feel like I'm one who naturally has this ability to come up with color schemes or to define a color scheme that matches what I'm trying to do and still looks nice. And so I rely on the color picker tool that allows you to do color scheme, or demonstrates color schemes by dragging around. What you'll see is I actually created my own palette here based off of one, and that's how you see sort of this highlighted region of orangey kind of color, and that the rest of the scene is sort of this variation of a singular blue hue, but different levels of vibrancy and different levels of luminance. But to use this color scheming tool, whenever you click on a color, the color picker in the material panel, you can go to these buttons that you see down here. And in this particular case, I used the accented color scheme, but you can see that it has all of these standard schemes that you can use for defining different colors. And so what's nice about it is just you can move it around, and as you move it around, you can kind of get a sense of, oh, is that a color scheme that I think would work well for my image? And you can select any of these colors and say add to palette, and that's how you can build your own palette. Clearly I was moving too fast and I didn't spell it correctly, but you can see that you can build up your palette, and even in keeping these same colors, you can, like I was mentioning, you can change how muted or vibrant it is, or you can still modify the luminance, all while maintaining that same sort of relationship that you see here. And you can get a whole lot of colors and just keep working with those colors so you have some consistency in your final image. So not too much there, just wanted to touch on that because I feel like it's a really powerful tool if you want it to help you find a color scheme for whatever image you're trying to create, especially if you're doing something like an illustration where you're coloring from scratch. All right, so now that we've talked about color schemes, and let's say we have our color scheme in mind, or you've built up a palette, really what we need to get from this starting image to anything we can work with, we have to have selectable regions. And usually the easiest way to do that in this particular case where you don't have colors already baked into the image is to rely on the lines. Now there's two methods that I can think of that can make this a little bit easier. One of them is to use the coloring page technique. And I have another video that covers that, where I show how you can do a series of effects and filters to try to really enhance where edges are, and then to be able to create a coloring page, something that would really bring out the lines. The other method is to just redraw the whole thing using vector graphics, and the although that is a much more laborious approach, depending on how complex your starting image is, it's going to make the following steps of using selections much easier, because you'll have a very predictable boundary that you can select on, whether it's by color or whether you have an outline. And I have another video also that covers how to draw all the many different shapes in vector graphics, and how to do very custom modifications to get everything that you'd see here, for example, drawable in vector format. Now for this particular case, because the paper is textured and because the lines are, not very consistent, like you can tell that there's, parts of the line that are white and parts of the line that are black. The coloring page approach doesn't work too well in this scenario, especially to create a full solid line. So what I would recommend is, if you're planning to do something like this and you want to scan it in and do this kind of selection thing, you want to make sure every line is connected where you want a solid region. You want those lines to be very discernible, like very black in this case, and for the paper to be smooth and totally white, not to have any textures. And in that case, using the coloring page method would probably be more effective, and it would save you a lot of time. But because of the fact that the coloring page method did not work too well in this particular case, I did end up redrawing the whole thing with vector graphics. And so you can roughly see what that looks like here. And I've colored in the different regions just to kind of get a sense of how this color scheme that like I mentioned started out would play out in this scene. But then eventually, the plan is to, add in some textures, add in some shadowing to give this thing a little bit more character. So now I'm going to switch over to a version of the image that kind of has everything in its final form, except for the path. And because I just want to focus on the path to demonstrate sort of how we take one region and take it from just a simple vector graphic, shape, blob, if you will, and actually give it some detail, something of interest. But before I jump into that, what I want to also just mention is, as you're, if you're doing the vector graphic approach, which, is going to have this sort of separate benefit that the coloring page method might not, naturally. But if you're going to do the vector graphic approach, I would recommend being very strategic and very mindful of how you're grouping your vector graphics. I think it can make modifications in the future a little bit easier. So instead of just having one whole vector graphic layer that has all of your objects on them, create separate layers with the different objects so that you have the ability to isolate, say, the roof or the main walls, or like in our particular case, the path. If you for whatever reason needed to replace that, it's a lot easier to replace a whole separate layer than to try to extract a single vector graphic and all of its layers and all that stuff. Once we get further into this technique, you'll see where that comes into play. But it just gives you a little bit more flexibility, even if you're changing colors or something. Even just as an example, if I were to remove the sky, for example, it almost has this idea of like changing just the atmosphere, right? Instead of this nice blue sky kind of a day, now we have something that looks more like a dreary, overcasty kind of a scene, right? So just another suggestion, if you're going the route of creating vector graphics for your illustration, just to help you in the later stages of your coloring and creative decision making. So now let's focus on our path so that we can kind of break down the steps that are involved in taking one of these, vector blobs and giving it some, definition, some detail, and some color. And the way we're going to kind of group all this, or the way we're going to assemble all this, is we're going to have a group that contains the vector object, a mask, and then we're going to have a layer that has the texture, and then a layer that's going to be sort of the color overlay, or the color representation of whatever that texture is, and then another layer for adding, hand-drawn shadows. And so you can see, as an example, even for this sort of this background land group here, there's highlights on the top, and there's, darkness on the bottom, and all of that, is applied in what I'm calling this sort of shadow layer. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to, take a look at our path group. I kind of, in my path group, I also include these steps here, so we can kind of ignore that for now. We're just going to assume we're starting with just this sort of vector graphic, which is the path itself. And so the first thing we want to do is create our mask. And the reason why vector graphics are great for this is because then we can use our magic wand, without even the tolerance being very high. We want the contiguous box to be checked so that it just only selects, the region that is touching where we're clicking. And I can just click right on this, vector graphic, and you can see it's going to naturally just find the whole region that is the vector graphic, because it's this nice clean shape, and it's the only thing on that layer. So now that I have the path selected, what I can do is I can go down here to New Mask and say Show Selection. And essentially what that is saying is it's going to create a mask for the whole layer, and the only thing that's going to be allowed to come through this mask is the region that is selected. So if I click that, then we'll see that this new group gets created, the mask layer gets created, and the vector graphic is still there. So then now I can right click to remove or cancel out the selection. And the next thing we're going to want to do is bring our texture in, or the thing that's going to give this path some, detail. So I got this texture from this cobblestone looking kind of, pathway texture from textures.com. This one works out pretty well because it's a seamless texture, and where that comes into play is in creating a pattern, right, that we can use the flood fill tool on. So by saving this texture in a folder where PaintShop Pro looks for patterns, then what we can do is I can create a new raster layer on top of our vector layer. Then I can click on one of these materials, left click, and then go to Pattern, and then search for the pattern of this path, which I totally forgot what I called it. Stone floor. And so what you can do is, once you have this pattern loaded, once you have this image loaded in as a pattern, then now you can use the flood fill tool, and you'll just need to adjust the scale to get, the level of detail of that pattern to match. And if you need to, you can also rotate it, and all the different features that come with doing a pattern in PaintShop Pro. So I'll hit OK, then we'll go to our flood fill tool, and then I can just click to fill it. And then what you'll see is it just, naturally, really what it's doing actually is filling the entire scene, but because we have our mask applied, it restricts the viewable region to just where the mask is allowing data to come through. Now, for example, if I felt like the pattern was a little bit too fine detail, which honestly I do at this case, we can undo. And then I can go back to this material once again, and then I can change the scale. And you can see that if I make like the scale, the number bigger, then the pattern, kind of enlarges in a way. So having now made the pattern a little bit larger, I can once again fill. That might be a little bit too much. So maybe something in between, and that's good enough. Now, to create the appearance of, things that are closer should be larger, and things that are further away should be smaller. If you want to apply that level of fidelity, we can choose the pick tool while we're on this raster layer. change the mode to shear, and then this will allow us to kind of bring in, these corners here and create this sort of like, the things that are far, are compressed, and the things that are close are, wider. But then we'll also probably want to switch back to scale and then bring this down just so that we don't have so much of that, stretching sort of, feel going on. So that looks good enough to me. Now, this is a realistic texture, and if you're going for a cartoony kind of a feel, you may, want to, reduce the fidelity of the image. And so one way to do that, like in this case, is to use the under add noise, add remove noise, you can do edge preserving smooth. And a lot of times, with something as detailed as this, you almost have to kind of crank it all the way to the max. And then you can see you get something that looks almost like, a painting, kind of a deal here, right? It just reduces some of that, grassy fidelity and even just like the edges of the stones. But one thing I don't quite like about it, though, is that it just really kind of muddies the far away bricks, right? Like it's almost like, and the rest of the image is fairly sharp. So, we kind of have to do this a little bit more strategically. So what we can actually do is we can duplicate this layer, and then let's just hide the copy for now. Or I'm sorry, let's leave the copy there, but let's apply the edge preserving smooth to the copy. So once again, adjust, add remove noise, edge preserving smooth, cranked up to the max in this case. So then we have our nice, kind of, reduced fidelity image. However, then what I can do now to return the fidelity in the air quotes farther away region, what I can do is with that copy layer selected, say new mask, show all, and now on this mask layer, I can just grab my regular paintbrush and use a black color, for example. Let's reduce its size, and we kind of want it to blend, so a low hardness is really good in this case. You can also, if you really want to blend it, you can have like a reduced opacity, and just start painting black. And what you'll see is now we're kind of bringing back some of that original detail, from the layer below it. And so then you don't kind of get this sense of just this really kind of muddied, blocks. You still have that nice sharpness going all the way through, even if as you get kind of closer to the bottom, it still has that nice, cartoony looking feel. So just one technique, as you're trying to do this. And again, discovering stuff like that is really just as you're building up your image, if there's something about it you don't really like, kind of find a way to, adjust that. And so that was something I didn't quite appreciate when I did that edge preserving smooth. So this was a way that I could mitigate that sort of issue. So we have our texture in place now, but it's not the right color. So then the next thing we want to do is adjust the color, so we can once again now create a new raster layer above our texture set and use the flood fill tool because our mask restricts the area for us that we care about. And I can, choose one of the colors that are part of my color palette and just click, once again. So now it's going to fill just that little region there. But to get it to allow the texture of the cobblestone to come through but still apply the color, I'm going to change, in this case, the blend mode to overlay, right? So now it's got, cobblestone, still detail, but a very strong blue color on top of it. In other cases, it all depends on, what your source image is and how much color is already on it. Obviously, the cobblestone's gray, so it's not going to dramatically affect the raster layer that has the color. But in other texture examples, if you don't mute it first, you may need to do something like color or color legacy as your blend mode to really replace the existing colors. So, kind of going back to our original, structure that we said, we've got our overarching group, we've got our mask, we've got our vector object, we've got our texture, we've got our color, and so then the last thing we need is the shadow, the shadow layer. So we can create a new raster layer once again, and in this case we're going to change the blend mode to soft light. And so then what this is going to do is it allows us to use black, white, and some grays in between or whatnot, and just standard paintbrush to kind of add just some like variation, right? If I just paint like around the edges, it creates this sort of sense of like a darkening of certain areas. So you're just kind of giving your this region, right, in this case the steps, just a little bit more variation in character. And they're like, I'm not doing anything that's like artistic here, or I'm not, there's no knowledge to what I'm doing. I'm literally just randomly painting around the edges to give it a little bit of variation. But those who know what they're doing a little bit better would come up with good reasons or good ways to know how they'd want to paint it, or it's all about just really what kind of look you're going for. But essentially though, that's the final step. And so when you look at the sum of this entire image and you look at all the different regions, whether it's the walls, the door, the windows, the roof, the sky, the ground, like all these things is really, it's just a re-implementation of this same structure grouped into different regions, using different textures and applying different colors, based on this color scheme. But then, all of this little, darker, lighter regions you see, kind of painted around on the house, for example, all of that is again just using a soft light blend layer with some dark, or like in the case of the hill, this brighter region here, painting with a light, white kind of color. So that's it for this one. I'll have to admit this was kind of an interesting and new thing for me. So, I appreciate, the viewer who provided me this image so that I could make this video. And I hope that you were able to learn a little bit more about at least one technique for being able to colorize an illustration. As always, if you have any questions or would like to suggest content, feel free to leave a comment. If you'd like to get updates of new videos that I post, click the subscribe button, and you can check the video description for ways to support and engage the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.